Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation, and this is Coffee and Wisdom, in which we talk about some of the strains that have led to the cultural understandings of spirituality and religion nowadays in the UK and the USA, and also where humanism has been, where it is now, and where it may be going in the future. The last couple of weeks, I've been talking about a strain of thinking that starts out with Madame Blavatsky in the mid-19th century. I'm calling this sequence, Some Have Thoughts, Some Have Oughts. That's an unattributed, anonymous statement, but the idea is that most people have the oughts. They go through life doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then there is this other select group who have thoughts. That's kind of a classist way of thinking about it, privileged, and et cetera. And that's one of the things I do want to be thinking about as we go along. Today, I want to talk about Peter D. Ouspensky, 1878 to 1947. He was a student of George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, who I talked about yesterday. One of the things I talked about with Gurdjieff is it's a little bit difficult to tell how much was the charlatan, how much was serious. He believed in a mysticism that was passed down through word of mouth from ancient days. He believed in a mixture of Eastern and Western philosophy and religions. And so his thinking becomes an amalgam of those things. Ouspensky was one of his early disciples. They were both from the Russian Empire of the day. And it is kind of important to understand that Gurdjieff, Ouspensky, and Blavatsky were all really victims of the violence and turbulence that were going on in the Russia of that day. They're all moving to the European world. Now, the interesting thing about Ouspensky is he was a mathematician, and that's why I've got this fourth dimensional representation going up here. He was a serious mathematician, and he believed in science. Now, there's no indication that Gurdjieff really understood science, like most mystics, theologians, and that kind of thing. That was his game, and he was into it, but didn't really go into the scientific realm very much. Ouspensky was a serious mathematician. He was reading the serious papers of the day on the question of what is the fourth and perhaps the fifth dimensions. We should mention that Einstein's special theory of relativity is published in 1905. So those ideas are in the intellectual air of the time. And Ouspensky's most famous book, Tertia Organum, appeared in 1912. So it's right in the middle of this introduction of these new ideas that Einstein and others are considering. It's interesting what Ouspensky has to say about his method, which is copied from Gurdjieff. He says there is no question of faith or belief in all of this. Quite the opposite. This system teaches people to believe in absolutely nothing. You must verify everything that you see, hear, and feel. Only in that way can you come to something. Sounds a lot like humanism, doesn't it? And that's an interesting aspect of what Ouspensky is going to be doing. He writes this in his book, in this book from 1912. In what direction may the fourth dimension lie? What is motion? Two kinds of motion, motion in space and motion in time, which are contained in every movement. What is time? Two ideas contained in the conception of time. And by the way, this is the way Ouspensky was writing. He was, again, a scientist, not a prose stylist, shall we say. And his writing is absolutely full of just these fragments of sentences, right? Two ideas contained in the conception of time. The new dimension of space and motion upon that dimension. Time is the fourth dimension of space. Impossibility of understanding the fourth dimension without the idea of motion. The idea of motion and the time sense. The time sense as a limit, surface of the space sense, hinted on the law of surfaces, the ether as the surface, Ryman's idea concerning the translation of time into space, into the fourth dimension, present, past, and future, why we do not see the past and the future, life as a feeling of one's way, won't on the subject of our sensuous knowledge. Okay, that's not communicating a whole lot, as you see, and that's one of the problems of his written work. But he does mention two very serious scientists who were looking into the space, time, and fourth dimension ideas. One, Riemann, was a 19th century mathematician, and Charles H. Hinton, a Brit, in the early 20th century. So he is reading the serious work in the idea of the fourth dimension in time and space. And he's also listening to his mentor, who he later separates from and says, well, you know, you're going a little bit too far out there, Gurdjieff. One book that, if you want to read, Tertiary Organum is just, as far as I'm concerned, but I'm not a scientist, but I don't get it. But his book, In Search of the Miraculous, the teachings of Gurdjieff, in which he tries to talk about his mentor and his mentor's ideas. As I mentioned yesterday, Gurdjieff said, no, you cannot write down this material. It is all about oral transmission. It's all about passing from student to teacher, teacher to student, and you just can't communicate it in the written word. Well, Ouspensky is going to try to do that. And so he publishes this book. You will notice that this is a contemporary edition of the book with a foreword by Marianne Williamson. You may have heard of Marianne Williamson. She is called often Oprah's spiritual advisor. Oprah's spiritual advisor, a little bit new age, and famous for her work in what's known as the Course in Miracles, which is, again, a very mystic work from the 1980s. That's something we'll talk about another time, but you see the continuation of how this mysticism is coming all the way out of the early 19th century, and it continues on Oprah today. Man is a machine, writes Ouspensky, but a very peculiar machine. He is a machine which, in right circumstances and with right treatment, can know that he is a machine. And having fully realized this, he may find the ways to cease to be a machine. All right? So, you know, some have thoughts, some have oughts. Here you go. These are the people who go from the oughts to the thoughts. Right. First of all, what man must know is that he is not one. He is many. He has not one permanent and unchangeable I or ego. He is always different. One moment he is one, another moment he is another, the third moment he is a third, and so on, almost without end. We discussed that a little bit with yesterday with Gurdjieff's ideas that the I or the ego is a shell that keeps us from the greater realizations of a mystical, multidimensional world. All right, so a peculiar machine in which right circumstances and with right treatment can know that he's a machine. And so that's the idea, is that we are going to wake up to this brand new way of being. And the last quote I'll read, when one realizes one is asleep, at that moment, one is already half awake. Probably the most important element of all of this is that his tie-in to Aldous Huxley, the perennial philosophy. Ouspensky moved to London and was lecturing there. Aldous Huxley and others went to his lectures and was therefore inspired toward this idea of perennial philosophy that, remember from a couple of weeks ago, that's the idea that there is one mountain of truth and many paths up that mountainside. Aldous Huxley, a Brit, will of course come to the US, where he gives lectures at Stanford University and inspires the two founders of the Esalen Institute. And there we go, around and around how these ideas permeate Western culture and are very much alive today as evidenced by Marianne Williamson being interested in them. So looking at these ideas, I want to talk tomorrow a little bit about how science begins to inform ideas of mysticism. But here's really the first step with Ouspensky. Well, thanks a whole lot for listening today as we go through these the ideas of mystics and cranks. You can help us out by going to PayPal or firstunitarian.org/donate and help keep the voice of humanism alive and well. You can find out a lot more about humanism and First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis by going to YouTube. We have 2 channels now, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks a whole lot, and we'll be back tomorrow. Thank you.